Good morning, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, and welcome to Law and Crime, where we cover some of the most interesting live trials and legal stories in the news today. And today, we have an explosive new trial for you out of Wisconsin. Many of you probably have heard about this case because it's taken the nation and all media outlets by storm. In fact, I should tell you that this case that I'm about to describe is so big that they had to move it to another courtroom just to fit all of the onlookers and media and jury panel into. It is a big, big case that we're covering here on the Law and Crime Network. And that case is Wisconsin versus George Burch. Now, George Burch is on trial for first-degree intentional homicide of Nicole Vanderheiden. This happened back in May of 2016. Her cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head and strangulation. Now, why are the police going after Burch? Why is he on trial? Well, because his DNA was found on Nicole Vanderheiden. That's right. George Burch, this is the way the story goes. Her body was found 3 miles from her home. The way the story goes is that Burch and Vanderheiden met at a Green Bay bar at the night she was killed. So this was May 20th, 2016. Burch says that they went to her house in his car and had sex in his car outside of her home. But this is where things take a weird turn. Burch says that Vanderheiden's boyfriend, Douglas Dietrich, knocked him out, and while unconscious, Dietrich was the one who killed Nicole. He claims that when he woke up, Dietrich held a gun to his face and forced him to move Nicole's body to the ditch. Dietrich was originally arrested for the crime, you see him right there, and he was later released due to a lack of evidence against him. Now, the DNA evidence was found towards Burch. There's also, the prosecutors will argue, that his cell phone data will track him that night, including to the field where Vanderheiden's body was found. The state, now here's where things get a little bit tricky. This is where the case takes an interesting turn. What is the evidence that the prosecution wants to use to exonerate Dietrich? Well, you probably heard about it because it's Fitbit data. That's right, Fitbit. The state wants to use Fitbit data that shows that Dietrich was sleeping at the time of the murder. The defense obviously wanted to exclude that data because they want to point the finger at Dietrich. They want to say that he's the one who did it. But the judge ruled that Fitbit step counting data could be allowed in court, but the sleep tracking data cannot be used in court. In other words, we can track where Dietrich was, what steps were taken, how he moved, but we can't track his sleeping data. That is what's really at issue in this case. That is what makes it unique, and that, from a legal perspective, it kind of sets a different precedent. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. Now, prosecutors are arguing, as I said, that Burch's cell phone data will track him to the area. The defense will be allowed to present evidence about Dietrich and Vanderheiden's text conversations from that night and claim that Dietrich used drugs. It should also be noted that Dietrich and Vanderheiden were living together and they had a child together as well. The defense, however, will not be allowed to discuss Dietrich's online activity, his relationships with other women, or details pertaining to a separate case against Dietrich that he has been charged with. Now, that's not even the strangest part about all this. George Burch, he's seen the inside of a courtroom before because he was accused of murdering someone in Virginia 20 years ago, and he was found not guilty. The facts of this case are so interesting, so in-depth, and we're going to talk all about it this morning. We expect live coverage in that courtroom at 9:30 Eastern Standard Time. As soon as we have a feed, we'll make sure to go to it. But before we talk about that case, I want to let our viewers know that tomorrow we are going to continue our coverage of the Janet Solander case out of Nevada. It's not, we're not covering it today. The court is not in session today, but it will begin back up tomorrow. Now, this is the woman who is charged with 46 counts of child abuse. That includes sexual abuse, physical beatings, burnings, extreme and cruel punishment, and humiliation in relation to 3 foster children that she and her husband, Dwight Solander, later adopted. That's right. And what we saw last week was the testimony of one of the foster children who basically explained what she witnessed about the beatings of these 3 young girls. So she described she was a 9-year-old girl. We weren't permitted to show you her on camera because of her age, but we can tell you what her testimony was. And she basically described some of the things that she saw. And one of the things that she said she saw was that Janet Solander took the head of one of the girls and slammed it into a counter, causing severe injuries. You keep hearing about this abuse. You even hear about the abuse of these 3 girls, how they only had 3 sheets of toilet paper to use. Apparently a lot of the abuse that we hear about stems from toileting issues. That's what makes this case a little strange. A lot of this is from toileting issues. The Solenders are accused of grotesque violations of being adoptive parents, and many of it stems from that. It's very strange. But we should also tell you that the ironic part about this case is that Janet Solender, we played you a little bit of that, she wrote a book. She wrote a book, that's right, about the foster care system. She was criticizing the foster care system. And she published it right before her arrest. Kind of ironic that somebody would talk about, see, there you go, foster care, how to fix this corrupted system. Kind of funny she would talk about that right before her arrest. Can't make this stuff up, ladies and gentlemen. So again, we are going to be covering that tomorrow. It's out of Nevada. Also, tomorrow, go to lawandcrime.com, because what we will also be covering is the sentencing phase in the case that we've been covering from last week, the Donald Smith case, who has been charged and convicted, nice to say, he has been convicted, in the abduction, rape, and murder of 8-year-old Cherish Periwinkle. That's right, we covered that case last week, and beginning tomorrow begins the penalty phase. What will happen to him? Will a jury sentence him to death? That's what's at stake in Florida right now. Will he be sentenced to death or life in prison? You're going to see this back and forth between the defense and the prosecution arguing which way this case should go. The defense wants to save his life. The prosecution wants to send him to death. It is a horrific case when you hear about the details of it. We covered it last week, and we're going to continue covering it here on the Law and Crime Network. So we have a busy day. Our main focus will be the George Burch case. As you know, the details are incredible. And when we come back, we're going to talk more about it. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. We're covering the George Burch case here on the network, a really interesting case, a brand new case here on the network, a case that has captured the nation by storm. George Burch, again, we expect the live feed at around 9:30 Eastern Standard Time. And again, he is charged with first-degree intentional homicide in the death of Nicole Vanderheiden back in May of 2016. I want to bring on our very special guest, Law and Crime trial analyst, Ken Belkin. Ken, good to see you. I'm glad you got the memo about the three-piece suit today.
I know. We're both three-piecing today. What are the odds of this?
You know, when I call you late at night, at 11 o'clock at night, talk about what we're going to wear the next day, I'm glad we coordinate.
I'm glad. I went gray. You stayed navy. This is a good look.
It's a good look. What's not a good look is for George Burch, because
No,
he is facing some pretty serious things. Now, you're a great criminal defense attorney. My question to you is, we're not on CSI, we're not on TV, we are on TV, but this is not a reality television show in the sense that this is not a regular television show. So when you see a defense aiming towards pointing the finger at someone else, how successful is that really? Where you have a defendant pointing the finger, he's pointing the finger at Nicole Vanderheiden's boyfriend, Douglas Dietrich.
I mean, I think it's great. I think juries love to have their Matlock moment. Juries want an underdog to root for. They want to believe in someone's innocence more than they do someone's guilt. And I think in this case, he's got a pretty compelling narrative to tell.
Really? Let's break that down for a second. Okay, we have a picture of George Burch. He's a big guy. Okay, I want to get his exact measurements for you. He's 6'7", 250 pounds. Douglas Dietrich is not that. He's much smaller. So the idea that Douglas Dietrich knocked him out, killed Nicole Vanderheiden, then pointed a gun in his face and forced him to dispose of the body, that's what we know so far. The case hasn't started yet. We haven't heard the opening statements. I don't know if that flies.
Well, look, let's see what evidence the defense can put out there to poke holes in the prosecution's theory. I mean, I'll tell you this. They were trying to, Dietrich's attorneys were trying to introduce Fitbit evidence, or the prosecution rather, to keep this stuff out. You know, that was upheld, which I think it should be. Fitbit technology, not really.
We'll get into that.
But I think it's a compelling story. It gives the jury something to really latch onto.
Well, when you have romance, okay, when you have a woman that was in a relationship with someone else, they lived together, they had a child together, and then according to Burch, he was fooling around with her in his car outside of her home. So you can try to see how a jury might be able to sink into that.
Look, it's a classic jilted lover gets vengeance story.
Yeah.
It's classic. It's as old as time itself, this story.
Well, let's talk about the new things in this case. So the big thing is the Fitbit data, right? The defense, the prosecution, wants to introduce Fitbit data to show that Douglas Dietrich was not at the crime scene. Now, they can only show the step counting data. They can't show the sleep data, the sleep tracking data. Why is that? Why would the court rule on one way and not the other way?
Personally, I don't think they should allow any of this data.
You don't think it's reliable?
I don't. Not that it's not reliable. It's easily, massaged. He could have left his Fitbit at home. Someone else could have been wearing his Fitbit.
But can't you battle that out with the cross-examination?
I guess you could, but in the final analysis, the Fitbit stuff, it's not proof beyond a reasonable doubt of his location. Cell site tower may be a little bit more reliable because people are really, they're going to bring their phones with them everywhere they go. But your Fitbit, you don't really need to have on you.
Are you telling me that Fitbit is not accurate in how many calories people are burning and how many steps they're taking?
I don't want to get sued by the Fitbit people, but I am not a Fitbit user myself, so we'll leave it at that.
Well, that's the interesting perspective. If they're going to use cell phone data to track where George Burch is, because the prosecution said they're going to do that and that's being allowed, they're going to say this is where he was. He was in the field where her body was found. He was at the bar where they allegedly met. Why can't you use Fitbit data?
Well, they're going to pinpoint it within a range of the cell site towers. They triangulate it between multiple towers. They don't get a totally exact location, but they get a pretty accurate one. But I think there's an argument to be made that people are more likely to have their cell phone on them than their Fitbit.
But let's say Douglas, well, isn't the whole nature of the Fitbit to keep it on you at all times?
Well, you might not keep it on you when you're engaged in the late night activities that these gentlemen might have been engaged in.
Maybe, but Douglas Dietrich maybe had it on, didn't even realize that he had it on, and I think that isn't there something to be said by the fact that the prosecution wants to put it in because maybe he had it on. So I think the back and forth is really about if it's reliable or not. But we're talking about cell phone evidence. I'm sure, you correct me, when cell phone evidence was first introduced into a court of law, there was probably a backlash about that.
Yeah, I'm sure. This might be just, some people catching up with the times. And maybe a few years from now, this Fitbit technology and the wearable, geolocation technology, it's all going to be admissible. But right now, I don't know. We have to see how reliable it is.
He was arrested, Douglas Dietrich, and he was released. There was no evidence to hold him. Won't that come into play in this trial? Won't the prosecution at least try to introduce that evidence, maybe from his arresting officer, the people that interrogated him? Will they have to do that?
Well, if the defense opens the door to it, typically arrests are not admissible, but really not admissible as evidence against a defendant. So this would be a unique scenario where they're introducing an arrest record to try and sort of exculpate someone who's not on trial, which is interesting.
So we're going to see the opening statements today. You don't imagine the prosecution would say, now the defense is going to come out and say that Douglas Dietrich did this. Here's why that's not true. Or are they going to wait for the defense to say that first?
If anything, I think hearing that he was picked up and released might not be good for the prosecution. It might beg the question, well, did they make a mistake by releasing this guy the first time?
But isn't it a good strategy for the prosecution to open that door first? Try to undercut the defense's narrative beforehand?
Well, I don't know that they're allowed to open that door unless the defense does. Because really their job is to prove the case Mr. Burch beyond a reasonable doubt. So the Dietrich stuff is not relevant unless the defense introduces it.
Kind of has the flavor of Aaron Hernandez a little bit, where they pointed the finger at Alexander Bradley. Will Dietrich testify in this case?
That's a good question. That's a very good question.
Well, if you're a defense attorney, would you put him
I'm telling Dietrich, you stay as far away from this case, and you count your lucky stars that this isn't People v. Dietrich.
I agree with you. It's going to be one to watch. Ken, stand by. We're going to talk about this case. Again, we are covering the George Burch case. We expect a live feed, maybe in about 10, 15 minutes or so in that Wisconsin courtroom, that packed Wisconsin courtroom. Everybody's watching this case, and guess where you can watch it? Here on lawandcrime.com. Our network is going to be covering it from gavel to gavel. You're not going to want to miss anything of it. Again, I also want to let our viewers know that tomorrow we're going to be covering the Janet Solinder case as well. That case out of Nevada, about that woman who's charged with 46 counts of child abuse. And we're going to be covering the Donald Smith penalty phase hearing to determine whether or not that man who abducted, raped, and killed 8-year-old Cherish Periwinkle will be sentenced to death. A lot at stake for both of those defendants, and a lot at stake here for George Burch today. In a case that talks about technology, jilted lovers, there's a lot at stake here, a lot talking about. You're not going to want to miss anything. We're going to go a quick commercial break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. We're covering a lot here on the network, and one of the things that we are covering is the Janet Solander case out of Nevada, which will begin again tomorrow. They're not in court today due to the holiday, but I want to talk a little bit about it. We are waiting for our live feed in the George Burch case out of Wisconsin. As soon as we do have that feed, we're going to make sure to go right into the courtroom. But I want to talk right now with our Law and Crime trial analyst, Ken Belkin, about the Janet Solander case, a case where this woman is charged with 46 counts of child abuse. Why is this even a trial, considering the fact that her husband, Dwight Solander, already pled guilty to 3 counts of, child abuse with 3 counts of child abuse with substantial bodily harm? Why is she even fighting this?
I mean, if you want me to enter the mind of Mommy Dearest here and try to predict what is motivating her, that I could not tell you. But somewhere along the line, plea negotiations broke down. And it's not because the husband's been flipped and is acting as a cooperating witness. He wouldn't be able to. There's spousal privilege. Right. And,
let's break. He can't be compelled to testify against her, but he could if he wanted to, right?
I mean, he could waive it, yeah, but there's no real reason.
The love between them is strong.
Rock solid. She's a very lovable woman, as you can imagine. Allegedly.
I mean, you see their crime photo together. They look like a loving couple, right?
They're a very loving couple. It would have been great if they could have bestowed some of that love onto the children that were placed in their care. My feeling is, look, the plea negotiations obviously broke down. These accusations are egregious, and for some reason, this woman would not take a deal, or one that was acceptable to her and her counsel was not offered. Whatever the case may be, she might have an axe to grind. She's written books about the foster care system. She may want to be some sort of twisted martyr.
I don't know if it's good to get into that mind, but it's something that we have to talk about. And again, we should say here on the network that she is innocent until proven guilty, until she has her day in court. And that's what's happening. She is in court. I want to play for you right now the testimony of Jan Finnegan, who is the nanny in this case. Now, she provided some testimony on Friday. I want to show that to you right now. Take a look.
Let's talk a little bit about the bathroom, okay? Were the Solander children allowed to just go use the bathroom if they needed to use the bathroom? Who gave you that instruction?
Ava.
Okay. So Ava said they weren't allowed to go to the bathroom if they wanted to?
No, and they couldn't use the downstairs bathroom.
So you're not allowed to use the downstairs bathroom, and you couldn't go when you wanted to. So what's the routine? If someone had to go to the bathroom, what happened in the house?
The routine, approximately maybe about 10 o'clock, if one of them had to go, she said, I'm sorry, I've got to go to the bathroom. I said, no problem, but we're not allowed to go by ourselves. So all 4 of us would go up 2 flights of stairs, and I know the first time I thought it was unusual, but go to the bathroom, and I would suggest, to the other girls, let's stand back and give her some privacy. They weren't allowed to shut the door when they went to the bathroom.
They weren't allowed to shut the door. So where would these other kids be seen?
They were standing by the banisters there, and they're laughing and joking with me because the camera was right watching me, and I didn't know if the camera had voice recording on it. They're going to be standing along the banisters here outside the master bedroom, and they're giggling and laughing at me, and they're telling me to be quiet.
Basis.
Non-responsive. It's responsive. Please continue. If there's more to add, if not, I can move on.
Well, I just found this highly unusual. They said they're only allowed to use a certain amount of paper in the bathroom, and they weren't allowed to shut the door. And I would ask her to stand back to give the other girls some privacy.
You mentioned something about toilet paper. What was that about?
They told me they weren't allowed to use 2 sheets of toilet paper.
Have you ever heard that before?
Never. Never.
There were other kids, though, living in that house, right? Autumn and Ivy. What were the bathroom rules for those kids?
There was no bathroom. They used the bathroom downstairs. They went to the bathroom when they wanted.
Did they have to stand in a group on the upstairs bathroom like
No.
the Solander children?
No.
Okay. Did Janet or Dwight explain why the difference to you?
No, not at all. No.
Remember the first time you ever did laundry at the Solander house?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
I just decided to do a load of maybe socks and children's underwear just to be helpful, you know, a week. And Ava said, well, you're probably getting in trouble. And I said, why? And she said, well, my dad inspects our panties. And I was just astonished or bewildered. A man inspecting children's panties. So in disbelief, I just thought, maybe she's making this up. But I did a load of laundry. And when he came home, he asked me not to do any more laundry. He likes to see their underwear.
Okay.
Just,
Let me ask you this. Did you ever want to see Autumn and Ivy's underwear? I just wanted to see the Solinder case.
Gives you the chills just listening to that. Ken, you're listening to this. Too amazing to believe. Too unbelievable to make up.
Yeah, I mean, what a world that these people even exist.
Toileting issues, big issue here.
Yeah, very disturbing testimony. I think, look, the fact of the matter is this is a very strong case, evidence-wise, against this defendant. You've got very credible witnesses, CPS workers.
Yeah.
You've got very credible documentary evidence, their investigative reports. And then you've got the children's testimony, which may be a little less credible,
Yeah.
but certainly tugs at the heartstrings.
There's a reason she's on trial. We're going to talk all about the evidence against her in a minute. I do want to let our viewers know when we come back, we might have a feed in the George Burch courtroom out of Wisconsin, the man who is charged with the first-degree intentional homicide of Nicole Vanderheiden. You're not going to want to miss anything. We're going to take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. We're waiting for that live feed in the Wisconsin courtroom for the George Burch trial. Remember, he is now on trial for intentional first-degree homicide of Nicole Vanderheiden that occurred back in May 2016. But his defense is he didn't do it, but Nicole Vanderheiden's boyfriend did, Douglas Dietrich. I'm here with Law and Crime trial analyst Ken Belkin. Ken, let's talk about the fact about what's going to be put into evidence. We talked about the Fitbit data, how it might be used to exonerate Dietrich, where he was that night, but we know that the defense will be allowed to present evidence about Dietrich and Vanderheiden's text conversations from that night, and they're going to present evidence that Dietrich abused alcohol and drugs. How is that allowed in evidence, those kinds of things?
Well, look, defense has a little bit more latitude than prosecution in their presentation of their case, because the prosecution's trying to prove each and every element of the offenses charged. Defense is really just trying to poke holes in that. So as far as the text messages go, their relevancy could be to maybe establish a timeline of Mr. Dietrich's actions for that night. It could be to look at the content and see that maybe they were arguing, maybe they were fighting words exchanged between the parties that would show that he might have had a motive or to do this.
And they lived together. So we know that Dietrich and Vanderheiden lived together. They had a son together. It's a little bit reminiscent of anybody who followed on the network, the Adam Matos case, where he lived with his I think it was his ex-girlfriend at the time, but you know, they had a text conversation because she was kind of getting involved with another man, and you never want to see those texts, right? You never want, as a defense attorney, you never want, well, I should say as a prosecutor, you never want those texts coming into evidence because
also,
it shows.
as a boyfriend, you don't want to see those texts. It might make you do something crazy.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ken. And I think there's probably something here that the defense, look, you said it well yourself, right? The defense wouldn't point the finger at someone else unless they have something to sink their teeth into. And it sounds like they might have something.
And
here.
look, let's be clear. The defense doesn't have to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. They just have to inject some reasonable doubt into the proceeding. And if they can give the jury another suspect to latch onto that had motive, means, opportunity, and is without alibi, the jury might take that and run all the way to a not guilty verdict.
How much does that become a problem of a trial within a trial? You're trying George Burch, but then it becomes the trial of Douglas Dietrich.
Well, that's why some jurisdictions limit the inclusion of third-party liability in criminal proceedings. You know, they don't like it when you try to confuse the jury with alternative suspects.
Do you think the jury would be confused here?
I don't think it's so confusing. I think the defense has a decent shot at this if they can get this stuff into evidence and they can really show that Dietrich might have been the one to do it. It is a compelling narrative of a jilted ex-boyfriend.
Yeah, it's the facts of the case are very interesting, and we're going to follow it here. But we're also covering the Janet Solinder case out of Nevada as well. It's on break today because of the holiday, but we'll be picking back up tomorrow. We've been playing you a little bit of the testimony that you might have missed from last week, and one of the interesting testimonies that we saw was Jan Finnegan, who is the nanny, describing many of the things that she saw. And let's not forget, Janet Solinder is charged with 46 counts of child abuse. And ladies and gentlemen, some of the facts that are described are so heinous, it's difficult for even me to repeat. I want to just play it for you. Here is the continuation of that testimony from last week. Take a look.
Were you working there around Valentine's Day in 2013? Remember anything about that day in particular?
I do.
Please, tell this jury.
The Valentine's Day, I thought maybe, well, these children missed out because they would go to public schools. They missed out on all the usual stuff. So after I got the other child from the bus stop, I parked my car near the gate. And we managed to get all the 5 children in my car, and I took them up to, I can't remember where, but anyway, the closest dollar store. And I let the children pick out whatever they wanted and wish them happy Valentine's Day. And I had hoped that one of the parents would call their children and wish them happy Valentine's Day, but none of that happened. And I wanted just to give the children a little joy for that day as much as I could, but that was
And did any of the kids say anything to Janet or Dwight about that?
I believe the older one said something to Janet, yes.
And what was the reaction?
Janet called the next day, and I answered the phone, and she spoke to me, and initially she was very nice to me and all this, and in my mind I'm thinking there's something behind this, and she went on to tell me that her husband had flown to where he was in Ohio apparently no, she was in Ohio, but wherever he was, he had flown to have dinner with her on Valentine's night, and she shared that with me, that she had a lovely day, her and her husband got together. And inside of me, I'm saying to this, what about these children? But, so the next day she called, and so after she, can I speak to Ava, she said. So sure, so I gave the phone to Ava. So Ava shared this with Janet, her mother. And her mother got really upset with her that I'd taken her to the store. And she called just to tell the daughter just to take the garbage can out at night. And I was just horrified, one of those big carts that you take out at night. I could have taken that out. It was dark at night at 7 o'clock. And she ended up crying. And I just put my arm around her and I just shook my head again. But there was no mention of anything about Valentine's Day to any one of the children.
Did they call on that day? Dwight or Janet call on that day? You mentioned that sometimes Janet's daughter would talk with Janet over Skype. Do you remember a time where Maya went up into an area where Danielle was on the phone with her mother?
I do.
Okay, tell us about that.
When I first got there, the younger daughter was not there the first week. Apparently she was out of town somewhere, but she came back and she would spend most of her time in the room. And I had been helping Maya that morning 2 or 3 times with her home, with her schoolwork. She got a little frustrated. And she cried a little bit, and I said, be okay. But much to my, I didn't know everything was being watched on the camera from upstairs, and she was telling all this stuff to her mother. Well, then they pulled Amaya upstairs, and I went up there, went into my bedroom to listen, and she slapped her in the face. And that night I called the husband, and I said, look, this kind of stuff can't go on. But instead of dealing with it, he just called his wife. And
Okay, let me stop you there. When you got to see Amaya, did you see Amaya after she had left that
when she
room?
came out of the room,
Tell me what her face looked like.
her face was very red, and you could tell she'd had tears in her eyes, yes.
Did kids ever talk to you, the Solender kids ever mention anything about hot water?
Yes.
Who told you about that?
Well, all 3 mentioned little bits here and there, but initially when they mentioned some of the stuff was hard to believe.
Okay, well I'm going to stop you there. Tell me about these kids' demeanor when they're sharing this with you.
They're telling me in fear that they'll get in trouble.
Where are you guys? Do you remember where you've
We're
been?
upstairs, and they told me that the mother had poured boiling water, and I can't remember which child it was, but poured boiling water over their head and scalded their head.
Right. Do you ever remember a time where Amaya was like sick with like a sinus infection or
Yes.
something? What do you remember about that? Which week was that?
It was the 2nd week, and I got there on a Sunday night, and where's Amaya? He had said,
I want to stop you right here. Let's just set the stage for a second. What time of year is this?
this is the end of January, probably, maybe
This
the
is
first week
winter
of
time.
February. It's winter time,
Okay,
yes.
please continue. Go ahead.
So I got there Sunday night, and I said to the children, where's Amaya? And then he had said, So he's running, oh, and he said he had taken her to the emergency room at the weekend. She had sinuses. Well, where is she? She was outside in the cold, and it was bitterly cold out there that Sunday night, I remember. She's outside picking up dog poop, and she's white as a ghost. So I just put my arm around her, and I said, why don't you come inside? I told her to quit what she was doing and brought her inside.
I want to turn your attention now to sleeping arrangements. Let's talk about the foster kids, Autumn and Ivy. Where did they sleep?
They had a nice room, they had their own room, they had a Winnie the Pooh TV and a regular bed, a nice.
What do you mean by a regular bed?
The regular bed that we all sleep in, like a regular twin bed with Winnie the Pooh sheets and a cover.
So they have like a duvet cover on it?
Pardon?
Like a comforter?
Yes, yes.
So it has sheets
Sheets, yes.
Comforter?
Pillows and, yes.
and a normal twin size bed. They had TV in their room?
They had a Winnie the Pooh TV.
What other sort of things were in that room?
There was also a closet, obviously, with all the kids' clothes and stuff like that.
Any decorations and wallpaper?
Yes.
What sort of decorations, if you remember?
Honestly, don't remember, but I think they were Winnie, I think most of the stuff was Winnie the Pooh.
And so did they each have their own bed?
That I don't remember because it was a twin bed, and I don't remember where the
But
little
you remember
ones-
there at least being a bed?
Of course, yeah, because, yeah.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about where the Solander girls slept.
Down the hall, there was a large room, and I guess it was a large bedroom. They slept in there, and to my astonishment, they all slept on little cots on the floor.
How many of them had regular beds like
None.
Autumn and Ivy?
None of the children,
Not one.
not one,
These are the adopted kids. Their own children
their own children,
did not have regular beds.
not one bed.
Well, let me ask you this. Was there even room in that room for a twin-size bed?
Oh, definitely.
Or were there room for two?
Yes, there
How
was
about
room.
three?
There was room.
Were there room for bunk beds?
Yes, but there was room for 3 individual twin beds, yes.
So instead, what did they sleep on?
There was even room for dresses, but there was none there.
So they had no dressers even in that room?
No,
What did they sleep on again?
cots on the floor,
Oh, how many comforters did they have?
none,
Well, I mean, let's take them one at a time. How many comforters did Amaya have?
none,
How many comforters did Ava have?
none,
How many comforters did Anastasia have?
none.
Did Dwight or Janet explain to you why they didn't have comforters, but the Autumn and Ivy did?
No,
Did Dwight or Janet offer you an explanation that maybe there was a medical diagnosis and part of the treatment plan was to not have a comforter on their beds?
no. They just had a little thin blanket. They had a thin blanket on their bed and a small pillow, and that was it.
Did you notice any differences between the clothing or kind of the quality of clothing that Autumn and Ivy wore versus the Solander kids?
Yes.
Tell us what the difference is that you noticed.
My first day there, when I had to walk to the bus stop, and so the children went to, this is my first time, go get their coats and shoes. And it was just like, I shouldn't use this expression, it was, to me, I felt like I was walking 3 urchins down the street. Little Amaya had to walk with a pair of cowboy boots, she didn't have any sneakers. And it's just, it was just horrifying for me.
Did they fit those shoes?
No.
Did you tell Dwight or?
I did at the end of the first week, I told Dwight she needed a pair of shoes, you know, we'll go get some, she never got any.
And let me just, maybe it's just I didn't hear you. When did you notice this thing with shoes that didn't fit? How early into this? First
I
week,
noticed
second-
it the first few days I was there.
Very first few days.
Yes.
So he tells you within the very
Because I'm
few.
walking to the bus stop and she's walking with a pair of cowboy boots, or cowgirl boots, whatever, flip-flop, but you know these things don't.
So let me ask you this. So you mentioned it to Dwight kind of immediately as you noticed it?
Yes, we do.
And he tells you, we're going to get her
Well,
some
there's
shoes?
some this weekend. Yes.
Okay. So that first weekend, Dwight comes home.
Yes,
And then did you show up the following Monday of week 2?
I did.
Were there any new shoes in the house? Okay. Dwight then goes away for a week, right, or for 5 days.
Yes.
But he comes back for weekend number 2, right? That Monday of week 3, did you have any new shoes?
No,
Okay. And then you leave by the end of the 3rd week?
yes.
Okay. Were there any morning chores for the Solander girls when they get up in the morning before they started their workday homeschooling?
Yes, I used to wonder in the mornings why it took so long for the little one, Anastasia, to come downstairs. And the neighbor would say, well, she's doing her chore. And I said, she's only 7 at the time, I think it was 7. And I said, what does she have to do? She had to get a bucket of water with pine sol and go in there and clean the bathroom every morning.
How many times did, let me just stop you there for a second. How many times did Autumn have to do that chore?
Not at all.
How about Ivy?
They didn't have any chores.
Did Dwight or Janet explain why that child
No,
had to do
they
that?
told me nothing, no.
You mentioned those beds that Autumn and Ivy had, those nice beds with the comforters and stuff. Was one of the chores for Autumn and Ivy to make their own beds?
No.
Did the beds get made?
Yes.
Who made the beds?
Ava.
Ava made
Ava's-
Autumn and Ivy's beds.
Ava's chore was to go make the beds of Autumn and Ivy. There was only one bed in there as far as I can remember.
Dwight and Janet explain that at all?
Nope.
Let's talk about the times that you kind of would see Dwight in the house, okay? Because, I mean, there were times that you guys would overlap a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Would he ever give you an explanation about why these rules were in place very much? What would he say about that, if anything?
There wasn't a lot said when he first came home one day. I approached him. About the rules, are you talking about the pennies or about the rules? Why did
Oh, please, just cover whatever rules you can remember.
Well, he just told me the reason he about the panties, that he inspects their panties to look for infections and stuff of that nature.
How about the food stuff? Any explanation on that?
He just said they had intestinal problems.
Okay. You ever see Dwight taking photographs of the kids, the Solander kids, when he'd be in the house?
No.
That's Jan Finnegan, the nanny, testifying on behalf of the prosecution in the Janet Solander case out of Nevada. And I'm here right now with Law and Crime trial analyst Ken Belkin. Ken, in a case a day where we're going to be talking about the defense, we're hearing so much about what's accused and towards Janet Solander. How do you defend someone like her? What is the defense strategy?
I mean, the defense strategy in this case should have been very strenuous negotiation and a favorable plea deal, because this is not going to go well. Look, her husband might get probation. You know, she
Oh,
could
I
have
think
had
he's
a
going
deal
to jail.
like that.
Now her husband, okay, Dwight Solander, pled guilty to 3 counts of child abuse with substantial bodily harm. He will be sentenced in May. You don't think he's going to jail?
I said he might get probation.
Okay.
What he also might get, he might get some kind of incarceration probation split. His attorney's going to argue for probation because, look, in a case like that, you've got to at least try to get no jail. But he might get a little bit of time in. She is facing way more time if she gets convicted at trial than she would have in a plea deal. And let me tell you something, the strength of the evidence in this case is damn near overwhelming.
But the defense really made the point in their opening statement that says the prosecution's going to have trouble proving a lot of this. And I feel like their job is just to cross-examine every single point and say, you don't know if this is true. How do you know this is true? And really cross-examine a lot of this, because some of these facts are so outrageous that I could see ample opportunity to say this really didn't happen.
All right, look, the defense got a great strategy here. Let's impugn the credibility of these traumatized kids. It's a great strategy.
You could do it of the nanny?
If these kids are really traumatized and really fabricating this stuff. Unfortunately, they've got a problem. Even if you believe the defense's argument that these kids were already messed up when they came to the Solanders' home, they got a problem. They've got CPS investigators that are totally neutral and have no dog in this fight whatsoever and are corroborating what these children say based on their observations.
Ken's talking about Heather Richardson, the CPS worker who testified last week for the prosecution, and some of that testimony we're going to play for you later. You can't deny what she says. But you know what, Ken? Maybe we'll read Foster Care, How to Fix This Corrupted System by Janet Solander. Maybe that's the answer to all this.
I'm going to review it on Amazon.
Too unbelievable to say. This case is amazing. But let's not forget, our main focus today is the George Burch case out of Wisconsin. As soon as we have a live feed in that courtroom, we're going to make sure to go to it. There's so much to talk about with this case. That is why it is being covered across the nation. But you go to lawandcrime.com. You come to our network. We're covering it gavel to gavel. You don't want to miss anything from it. This is the case of that intentional first-degree homicide, that of Nicole Vanderheiden. It's about a love triangle. It's about Fitbit data being used in court. There's a lot at stake here. You don't want to miss anything. We're going to take a quick commercial break, and when we come back, we'll talk all about it. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. We are covering the George Burch case here, and I should let you know there's an update in the courtroom. The stream has not started. The judge is taking care of some housekeeping matters regarding the jury before they're actually brought in. As soon as we do have a live feed in that Wisconsin courtroom, we're going to go to it. But I just want to let you know about what's happening. First witness, we're told, is going to be a minor who's not allowed to be put on camera, so we can't show it to you. We can't show you this testimony, but I want to let our viewers know that's what's going to happen. There's also been, the prosecutors are asking for Vanderheiden's sister. Remember, Nicole Vanderheiden is the victim in this case. The prosecutors are asking for her sister to be allowed to sit in on the entire trial as a crime victim. So we're going to talk about that. And then other witnesses are being sequestered until they testify. Vanderheiden's mother is already being allowed to sit in. And the reason there's such a uproar over the media and what's going on is because this case has been getting such attention, and that's why we're covering it here on the Law and Crime Network. I'm here with Law and Crime trial analyst Ken Belkin. Ken, one of the interesting things about this case is that what's actually happening in the courtroom. So you tell me in your experience, Burch is wearing a stun belt underneath his clothes so that it's controlled by remote control. They can provide an electric shock to him in case he acts out in the courtroom. Is that something that's typical in courtrooms?
No, that's not typical in courtrooms. Although,
what does that tell you?
That
he's a dangerous guy?
This guy might be a little bit out of sorts. I'd be worried that this is a little bit prejudicial for the jury to see this. I hope it's not bulging. I hope the jury can't really tell, because you don't want your client to even have any look of guilt on him. You know, I've had clients who are incarcerated, and when they come to trial, I've had to go shopping for them and get them outfits so they aren't in the prison wear. Yeah,
the appearance is everything. Appearance is everything, and how they view to the jury is incredible.
Look, you can't fake a first impression, you know.
We covered a case here on the network. It was a second-degree murder case. 3 men were in a nightclub, and one of the guys was wearing like bow ties, and he was smirking towards the jury. You have to imagine that played effect. He was found guilty.
Yeah.
But, you know, I'm not sure why. There's that was a whole different case. But here, the idea that Mr. Burch has been in and out of the courtroom before. He was found not guilty in a murder 20 years ago, but it was very different than what you have here. It wasn't about a young woman that was killed. It was about a gang member who was shot and killed, and the police, he was on trial. The police, the investigators, they couldn't positively identify the bullet as coming from him. Different case. Jury probably won't be able to know about this.
Jury is definitely not going to be able to know.
But what does that tell you? That this already been in trial once before?
I'm going to put my defense attorney cap on for a second and say, Jesse, it doesn't tell me anything. All it tells
what does it tell Ken Belkin?
All that's evidence of is the fact that he was charged with a crime. And as we all know in America, you are innocent until proven guilty. And as such, you know, arrests and being charged with a crime and being prosecuted, it's not admissible. The jury can't hear about it unless there was a conviction.
Okay, great. Ken, I couldn't have said it better myself. It's a very good defense cap on. Ken Belkin, the person now, as a trial watcher, all of our watchers watching. It adds to the story of this. It adds to the flavor of this. A guy who's on trial, who's already been on trial 20 years ago.
Yeah, Ken Belkin, Streetwise Brooklyn Jew, says maybe this guy's up to a little bit of nonsense in his life.
Yeah, well,
normal people don't get accused of murder once in a lifetime, let alone twice.
Twice. And okay, so the prosecution, we're waiting for them to deliver their opening statement. Actually, I think we have a view of the courtroom right now. There you go. The judge is speaking. As soon as we have audio, we're going to make sure to give it to you. The judge is handling some housekeeping matters before the opening statements today. And actually, we have a live feed right now. So let's go into the courtroom in the George Burch case. Welcome back, everybody. Well, you just heard the opening statements by both the prosecution and the defense. Ken, real quick, what'd you think?
I mean, I thought the defense did a masterful job of weaving in George Burch's story. I didn't think the prosecution was very convincing, but look, like we said before, the evidence that the prosecution is going to put forward, it's totally consistent with the narrative that defense counsel for Mr. Burch is going to put forward.
Sure, but I didn't hear the defense explain how George knew Nicole or how he was involved in this, but I guess they're waiting for him to take the stand and he'll explain it himself.
Mr. Burch is going to tell that story to us.
Ken, thanks so much for coming on. We can't
Thanks,
wait to have
Jesse.
you back, and stay tuned because we have a lot to cover here on the network. We're going to be covering the George Burch case today. As you can see, there's a lot at stake with this story. There's a lot of interesting narratives about it, and we're not going to want to miss anything. As soon as we come back, we'll make sure to have a live feed in that courtroom. We're going to take a quick commercial break, and we'll be back in a minute. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. We are covering the George Burch case here on the network, and you just heard the opening statements by both the prosecution and the defense. When the DA, the district attorney, was providing their opening statement, it was a very, very clear-cut path to why George Burch is guilty. Very clear. His DNA was found all over her body, all over Nicole Vanderheijen's body. His cell phone pinged him in the different locations that night, including where the crime scene was and where her body was found. Seems to be pretty straightforward until the defense took their chance, and they said that this is all inaccurate, that all of the evidence you see, they're going to agree with, that George Burch's DNA was on Nicole, that he was in all the areas that you see. However, the narrative is completely off. The narrative put forward by the state is incorrect, because it was not George Burch who committed this crime, but Douglas Dietrich, Nicole's boyfriend. And that's where things take an interesting turn. Now, you heard the defense explain this in a very eloquent opening statement, basically explaining why Douglas had the motive to kill Nicole, that he was angry, they had a toxic relationship. The night in question, they were fighting. She walked off alone. He was drinking, doing drugs, talking to other women. It's all makes sense. But what you didn't hear was how George Burch, the defense attorney's client, and Nicole Vanderheijen, the victim, how they knew each other. Why was his DNA on her? Well, the reason you have to imagine is because we are going to wait for George Burch to eventually take the stand when the defense is handed the case. We're going to wait to hear George Burch's narrative, and that is what the defense is going to do. Interesting strategy, waiting for the defendant to present the story as opposed to having the defense do it in their opening statement. We'll have to see if it works. They are in a break right now. As soon as we have a live feed, we're going to make sure to go to it. In the meantime, I want to touch upon a case that we are covering tomorrow. We are going to continue our coverage in the Janet Solender case of Nevada. This woman is charged with 46 counts of child abuse, including sexual abuse of 3 foster children that she and her husband, Dwight Solender, later adopted. Now, to help explain the detail of this abuse, we saw the testimony on Friday of Jan Finnegan, who is the nanny. You saw a little bit of the testimony earlier in the day. I want to continue playing that for you, and as soon as we do have a live feed back in the George Burch case, we'll make sure to go to it. In the meantime, here's the clip from the Janet Solender case.